A week later, a new resident arrived at the Wellbridge Sundown home. Miss Smith was ancient and tottery and deaf, and she was very rich. Mrs. Winnipeg was waiting to greet her, and her greedy eyes lit up when she saw the poor old thing helped out of the taxi by her great-nephew. She wasn't going to give her any trouble, that was certain. And the nephew and his family were off to Australia, she'd said on the phone, so there'd be no relatives to poke and pry. "It's very kind of you to let me stay in your lovely home," quavered Miss Smith, and winked at Daniel. Madame Rosalia might be a show-off, but there was nothing she couldn't do with makeup. Hecky's wrinkles would have fooled anyone. Her hair was white, brown blotches covered her skin. "Not at all. I'm sure you'll be very happy with us," said Mrs. Winnipeg in a plummy voice. "You've brought some money with you. Cash I like, it makes less work." Miss Smith fumbled in her handbag. "That'd be fine," said Mrs. Winnipeg, grabbing some notes. "Now, if your dear nephew will just say goodbye, we'll soon make you comfortable." An hour later, Hecky was in a small bedroom in which 4 beds had been shoved so close together that you could hardly move between them. 3 wispy-haired ladies in nightdresses sat one on each bed, shivering with cold. "You shouldn't have come," said one of them hopelessly. "It's a dreadful place, this." "Oh, I expect we can soon get things cheered up," said Hecky. But she was so angry she could hardly speak. She'd decided not to do anything till she was sure that the home was as bad as a young nurse said. Now she knew that it was worse. She'd seen Major Holden tied to his chair because he liked to wander about, and the staff said he got in the way. She'd seen old Sam force-fed with revolting stew because he wouldn't eat since he lost his parrot. And Mrs. Winnipeg didn't want him to die and bring the doctor to ask awkward questions. She'd seen a woman as thin as a skeleton slip on the bathroom floor and be scolded for carelessness. At 8, a nurse came to turn out the light. "I'd like a hot water bottle," said Hecky. "I'm cold." "A hot water bottle?" said the nurse. "You must be out of your mind." All the kind nurses had left. Only the cruel ones could stand working for Mrs. Winnipeg, and most of them weren't real nurses at all. At midnight, Hecky got up and stood by the window. Everything was ready. All her helpers knew what to do. Daniel and Sumi were taking it in turns to mind the shop and sit with the dragworm. Joe had borrowed his father's keys to the west gate of the zoo and would come with Boris in his van to drive whatever it was to safety. Only, what was it going to be? Hecky wasn't sure. Nothing cuddly, of course. "I'll just have to see how I feel when the time comes," she said, and went back to bed. Breakfast was lumpy porridge and dried bread. "I want some butter," said Hecky. "I've paid good money to be here, and I want some butter on my bread." After breakfast, she said she'd like to go out for a little walk, and at 11 she wanted a nice cup of coffee. By lunchtime, it was clear that something would have to be done about Miss Smith, and the matron went to ring Mrs. Winnipeg. "She's a troublemaker, Mrs. Winnipeg. I don't know what to do with her." "Do with her? Do what we always do," snapped Mrs. Winnipeg. "Undress her, take her teeth out, and shut her in her room." "Well, I tried," Matron broke off, not really able to explain why it wasn't easy to undress Miss Smith. "Her teeth don't take out," she complained. "All right, I'm coming up anyway at 3 o'clock to do the accounts. I'll soon sort her out." And Hecky, who had been listening at the door, held up 3 fingers to Boris, waiting in the street in his parked van, and settled down to wait. The residents were sitting in a circle in the lounge when the white Rolls-Royce drew up in front of the door. Hecky could see the way they cowered at the sight of it, and her chin went up. Listen, she said quickly. How many of you can stand up without help? How many of you can walk? The circle of faces stared at her blankly. Come on, she said. Some of you can. I know, I've seen you. Still the poor browbeaten creatures just stared up at her. Then slowly, Major Holden's hand went up, then Sam's, then those of the ladies who shared Hecky's room, until almost everybody's hand was raised. Good, said Hecky, because I'm going to have a few words with Mrs. Winnipeg, and I want you to stand quite close in a circle. I need her to come right up to me. I don't want her running away, and I don't want anything else running away either. Can you do that? The old people nodded. A little colour had come into their faces, and Major Holden put up his hand in a salute. The door opened, and Mrs. Winnipeg came into the room. She saw all the residents dozing as usual, and she marched straight up to Miss Smith. Now then, I hear you've been making trouble, she said. Just exactly what is the matter? Hecky rose from her chair. Everything is the matter. Just exactly everything. This place is a disgrace. The food is revolting, the staff are unkind, and you are a vicious woman. Mrs. Winnipeg's mouth opened, her chins quivered. How dare you? How dare you speak to me like that? She marched towards Hecky, which was exactly what Hecky wanted, and the old people had heard and understood. They were doing what Hecky had asked. One by one, with their walking frames and their sticks, they stood in a circle round Hecky and Mrs. Winnipeg. They were frail and tottery, but there were a lot of them. Well, I do dare. Why can't Major Holden have some boot polish when he's paid you thousands of pounds? Why did you take away Miss Merrick's window box? And where is Mr. Sam's parrot? Answer me that. Why, you disgusting old woman. I'll have you put away. I'll have you put in a loony bin. I'll ring the hospital and tell them to come with a straitjacket. This threat had always worked before, but Miss Smith only laughed. Try it. Just you try it. Mrs. Winnipeg blinked because Miss Smith seemed taller somehow, and her voice had changed, but she moved forward and grabbed Hecky's arm. And now Hecky had her. Her own free arm came round Mrs. Winnipeg's fat throat. She kicked her slipper and her toe curled and throbbed with the power that came from it. Mrs. Winnipeg was scared now. She wanted to get away, but she was caught in a ring of old people. If she pushed through, someone would probably keel over and die at that, and that meant doctors and people asking questions. And Hecky's grip was tightening. Her knuckle glowed like a ring of flame. Spush! Spluttered Mrs. Winnipeg. Oink! And then it was over. At the last minute, Hecky had known exactly what would turn out best. And as they saw what had happened, there appeared on the faces of the old people a look of wonder. And one by one, their wrinkled faces broke into smiles. But of course, no one believed them afterwards. When Mrs. Winnipeg had been gone a few days and the police came and the inspectors from the council, no one believed a bunch of old people when they explained what had happened. Old people have fancies, everyone knows that, but the inspectors were so shocked by what they found in the Sundown homes that they closed them then and there and moved the residents to council homes where they were properly cared for and had plenty to do. Miss Merrick was given a little bit of garden, and Major Holden was put in charge of all the shoe cleaning, not just his own, so that everybody looked smart. And Sam's parrot stopped saying, "Where's Sam?" and said some other things instead, things it is better not to mention, because he'd been at sea with Sam for many years and had picked up some very fruity oaths. But still no one believed the old ladies and the old gentlemen. not even when a brand new warthog turned up in Wellbridge Zoo. A warthog with a greedy snout and blue eyes and a way of banging its back parts furiously against the sides of the cage. Not even then. Chapter 8. A new statue had appeared in Kidchester Town Park. It was made of marble and very lifelike. You could almost feel the hair on its moustache and the waxy blobs inside its ears. The council thought that the statue had been put up by the Lord Mayor, and the Lord Mayor thought it had been put up by some ladies who called themselves the Friends of Kidchester and wanted to make their town a beautiful place. But the statue hadn't been put up by any of these people. It had been dragged there in the middle of the night by the stone witch, Dora Maybury, who had been Hecky's friend. Dora had found a nice garden gnome business in Kidchester, which was about 30 miles from Wellbridge. She made dwarves and fairies and mermaids for people to put round their garden ponds. And in her spare time, she tried to do good because that was what she and Hecky said they would do. When she turned Henry Harrington to marble and put him in the park, she was certainly making the world a better place. She had heard Henry's wife scream night after night while he beat her, and seen his children run out of their house with awful bruises. And when she met him rolling home from the pub, she had simply looked at him in a certain way, and that was that. But she was lonely. She missed Hecky all the time. Dora was shy. She was apt to grunt rather than speak, and this made it difficult to make new friends. Far from having a Bonty Bock for a familiar, Dora didn't have a familiar at all. What she did have was a ghost, a miserable wispy thing which had come with the old wardrobe Dora had bought to hang her clothes in. The ghost was a tree spirit who had stayed in her tree when the woodmen came with their axes and floated about between the coat hangers, begging Dora not to chop down the wardrobe. I wonder if I should write to Hecky, said Dora to herself as she lowered a soya sausage into boiling water for her supper. But why doesn't she write to me? Then she went out to the shed to feed her hat. She too had gathered up the snakes that hissed and slithered on the lawn after the quarrel and brought them with her to her new home. But the hat was really the only pet that Dora had, so she was feeding it too much and it was getting fat. The black mamba was like a barrel. Soon it would be impossible to tie it into a bow. Oh dear, thought Dora. Nothing seems to be going right. There was plenty to do in Kidchester. She had plans for Dr. Franklin, who kept 12 dogs in the basement of his laboratory and was doing the most horrible experiments with them. Not experiments to test new medicines, just experiments to test face creams for silly women who were afraid of getting old. Dr. Franklin would look nice in granite, and she knew exactly where she was going to put him. By the fountain in the shopping centre, so that the children could climb on him and the pigeons would have somewhere to sit. But nothing is much fun if you are lonely, not even doing good. And when poor Dora got back to the kitchen, the saucepan had boiled dry and the sausage had exploded in a most unpleasant way. Should I move to Wellbridge in secret, thought Dora, scraping the sausage into the dustbin? Perhaps if we met by accident, Hecky and I would fall into each other's arms, but if she cut me dead, I couldn't bear it. And poor Dora stood rubbing her nose, not knowing what to do. Chapter 9. Warthogs are not beautiful with their hairy grey bodies and messy snouts, but the new warthog, which had arrived in Wellbridge Zoo, was very popular. Lots of people came and watched it snort and snuffle and wallow in its trough, and the way it ignored the other warthog in the cage, barging into him as though he wasn't there, made everybody laugh. Perhaps it was the mysterious way the animal had arrived. sent by an unknown person as a gift to the zoo. That made people so interested. It had turned up in the middle of the night with a label round its neck, which said, "My name is Winnie." But whatever the reason, it certainly pulled in the crowds. The dragworm, meanwhile, settled down happily in Hecky's shop. Everyone made a fuss of him, even the wizards and witches who had sneered. But he was not at all conceited. What he liked best was a quiet life, sleeping in his basket, going for careful walks with enough time to think about which of his legs was which, and having baths. Because of having been a duck, the dragworm loved to be in the water, and he was never happier than when he was sitting in Hecky's bathtub with Sumi washing his hair and Daniel scrubbing his back. Hecky was still hoping that he would learn to talk. Familiars often do, and it is a great comfort to witches having someone to speak to when they are alone. But though he understood so much of what was said to him, the dragworm didn't open his mouth, except to smile or yawn or eat. The dragworm was very fond of eating, and what he ate, because he was after all a dragon, were princesses. Not real ones, of course, they would have been too big, and anyway, there weren't any in Wellbridge, but princesses made out of gingerbread, which the children baked for him in Hecky's oven. And it was a batch of these princesses which led Hecky to a man called Ralph Ticker, who must have been about the nastiest person in the world. Hecky wasn't after Ralph Ticker. She didn't even know he existed. She was after a mugger who had broken the skull of an old lady in a back lane and snatched her handbag. Hecky had decided to turn him into an okapi, which is a beautiful animal halfway between a zebra and a giraffe. Wellbridge Zoo didn't have one, and she thought it would be nice if they did. So she spent the evening tottering through the back alleyways of Wellbridge with a handbag full of money, waiting for the mugger to come. But so far, he hadn't. It was half-term. This was usually a bad time for Daniel. Sumi's aunts and uncles came to visit, and she went on outings with her cousins, and Joe spent his time with his father in the zoo. Up to now, Daniel had dreaded the holidays, which meant being alone in the tall, gloomy house, while his parents went on going to the university. But now it was Daniel who was the lucky one, because he could spend all his time in Hecky's shop. And it was Daniel who went to the market to buy 6 eggs, and Daniel who baked the princesses for the dragworm's supper. He was whistling as he took the baking tray out of the oven and put in the currants for the princesses' eyes and the slithers of glacé cherries for their mouths. They had come out beautifully, with their crowns scarcely wonky at all. And as soon as they were cool enough, he scooped one out and put it on the dragworm's plate. The dragworm bounded out of his basket. He put his snout down on the plate. Then he lifted his head and gave Daniel a look. And what the look said was, "What exactly is this rubbish?" Daniel was annoyed. "They're absolutely fresh. I baked them myself. Now please eat up and don't make a fuss." He held the princess up to the dragworm's nose. The dragworm closed his eyes and shuddered. Then he turned his back on Daniel and climbed back into his basket. It was at this moment that Hecky came back. She was not in a good temper because, as she had been hovering in a dark lane hoping for the mugger, a kind policeman had come and insisted on seeing her home. "The dragworm's off his food. He won't eat his princess." Daniel was upset. When your parents have told you for years and years that you're no good, you don't have much confidence, and Daniel was beginning to wonder if he'd done something wrong. Hecky frowned. "It doesn't look to me as if he's sickening for anything. I hope he's not going to turn faddy." She broke off a leg and held it under the dragworm's nose. Once again, the dragworm turned away, and if he'd been able to speak, there's no doubt that he would have said was, "Yuck." Daniel now took Heki into the kitchen and showed her exactly what he had used to bake the gingerbread: the flour, the sugar, the spices, the honey. And one of these, he said, holding up the carton which had the words "Fresh Farm Eggs" stamped on the box. But it wasn't rotten. I smelled it carefully. There were 5 eggs left in the carton. Heki picked up one and carried it to the window. "Oh dear," she said. "Oh dear, oh dear." And then, no wonder the poor dear creature wouldn't eat. For a wickedness detector, an egg like this would be quite impossible to swallow. Daniel was puzzled. But surely an egg can't be wicked, can it? Heki was still holding the egg to the light and shaking her head to and fro. Not wicked, perhaps, but unhappy, full of bad vibes. An egg? Why not? An egg is made up of the same things as a person. Everything in nature can suffer. Plants, seaweed. Seaweed can be absolutely wretched. You must have seen that. So they gave the dragworm some dog biscuits, which he ate, and it was decided that Daniel would go to the market first thing in the morning and ask the storeholder where she got her eggs. Because an unhappy egg means an unhappy chicken, said Heki, and an unhappy chicken we cannot and will not allow. The lady who had sold Daniel the fresh farm eggs was helpful. They came, she said, from Tricklington Poultry Unit, about 10 miles north of Wellbridge. They weren't bad, I hope, she said anxiously. I've been promised they're not more than 2 days old. Daniel said no, they weren't bad, not like that. 2 hours later, he got off the local train at Tricklington. It was 11 o'clock in the morning and the little station was almost empty. He asked the way to the poultry unit and was directed down a footpath which ran across 2 fields and over the river to some low corrugated iron buildings. But he won't thank you for going there, the station master told Daniel. Who won't? Asked Daniel. Mr. Ticker, the owner. Keeps himself to himself, does Mr. Ticker. As Daniel made his way down the path, he wondered if he had been wise to come alone. But both Sumi and Joe were helping out at home. And anyway, what was the use of being a wickedness hunter if you didn't do anything? Mr. Ticker's poultry unit was surprisingly large. There were 2 buildings, each of which looked more like an aircraft hangar or a railway shed than a farm. A high fence surrounded the area, and there were notices saying, "Keep out," and "Trespassers will be prosecuted." Daniel's heart was beating rather fast, but he told himself not to be silly. Mr. Ticker was only a chicken farmer. What could he do to him? Daniel reached the door of the first shed. There was nobody to be seen. The high door was bolted and barred, and above it was another notice saying, "No entry." He walked over to the second building. Here the door was open a crack. He slipped inside. The light was poor, and at first, mercifully, Daniel could scarcely see. Only the smell hit him instantly. A truly awful smell of sickness and rottenness and decay. Then came the sounds, half-strangled cries, desperate squawks. But now his eyes were becoming used to the gloom. He could make out rows and rows of wire cages, piled from floor to ceiling on either side of narrow concrete corridors that seemed to stretch away for miles. And he could see what was inside the cages. Not 1 chicken, but 2, packed so close together that they could hardly turn their heads or move. Unspeakable things were happening in those cages. In one, a bird had caught its throat in the wire and choked. In another, a chicken, driven mad by overcrowding, was trying to peck out its neighbour's eyes. There were cages in which one bird lay dead, while the other was pressed against its corpse. And yet somehow, Unbelievably, the wretched creatures went on laying eggs, large brown eggs, which rolled onto the shelf below, ready to be driven to Wellbridge Market and make Ralph Ticker rich. Daniel was turning back, knowing he'd be sick if he stayed any longer, when he heard voices at the far end of the shed. "There's another 17 birds died in the night, Mr. Ticker. Well, mince them up, feed them to the rest, and burn the feathers out at the back." "I don't like to, sir. People have been complaining about the smell. If they call the RSPCA, they won't." And then, "Who's that up there?" "Why, it's a blooming kid." Daniel tried to run for the entrance, but it was too late. Mr. Ticker pulled down a switch and the building was flooded with light. There was wild clucking from the hens, and then the chicken farmer, followed by his assistant, came running up the aisle. Then a hand banged down on Daniel's shoulder, and Mr. Ticker's red face with its bulbous nose was thrust into the boy's. "What the devil are you doing in here?" I was just looking, Mr. Ticker." Mr. Ticker was shaking him so hard that Daniel could scarcely get out the words. "Did you see the notice? Did you see where it says, 'Keep out'?" With each question, he shook Daniel again. "You were snooping, weren't you? You were spying. Well, let me tell you, if you say one word about this place to anyone, I'll get you. I'll get your mother too. I've got people everywhere. People who throw acid. People with guns. Got it?" He pushed Daniel forward, and the boy stumbled out and ran over the bridge of wooden planks, across the fields, ran, panting, for the safety of the station. And Ralph Ticker looked after him with narrowed eyes. "It's no good, sir," said the assistant when Daniel was out of sight. "Even if the kid keeps quiet, they're beginning to talk in the village." Ticker said nothing. Twice before, the inspectors of the RSPCA, those snooping do-gooders, had closed down his chicken farms. Once in Cornwall, once in Yorkshire, and the second time he'd been fined £200. But what was £200? Chicken feed, thought Ticker, grinning at his own joke. Each time he'd made a whopping profit before they got wise to him. "Time to move on, Bert," he said. "Scotland this time, I think. You know what to do." "But, Mr. Ticker, there's 4,000 chickens here. I can't chop the heads off." "Oh, I think you can, Bert. Yes, really, I think you can." "You've got to do something," said Daniel, trying not to cry into the nice cup of tea which Hecky had brewed him. "You've got to turn him into a chicken himself and force him into one of those cages and—" "Now, Daniel," said Hecky severely, "how many times have I told you that the second someone becomes a chicken, he is not a wicked chicken. He is a chicken who needs only the best. And anyway, the zoo doesn't want a chicken. What the zoo wants is an okapi. Now drink up and leave everything to me." The next day, without saying anything to the children, Hecky called the wizards and witches to a meeting. She had made a map of the Tricklington poultry unit from Daniel's description and was feeling important like Napoleon. "Now, you all understand exactly what you have to do?" she asked. "I'm to flush him out of the building," said the cheese wizard gloomily. He was not looking forward at all to changing Mr. Ticker into an okapi. He had never seen an okapi and didn't know if he would like it, if he did, and he couldn't remember a single spell for flushing anybody out of anything at all. "And I'm to lure him into the field with my beauty," said Madame Rosalia, fluttering her false eyelashes, which were made of spiders' legs. Hecky frowned. "I didn't say anything about luring. What I said was, I want him in the field in front of the shed because I shall need space to work in. Boris will take you all down in the van and park it across the drive so that Ticker can't escape in his car. And you, Frida, must stop him crossing the bridge. If he makes a dash for the station, we're done for." "How?" said the Golden Witch. "How do I stop him?" "How? Good heavens, woman, you're a witch. Root him to the ground, wrap his legs in ivy. Just stop him. And that's where I'm leaving it for today.